Get your Bibles out. Turn to the book of Nehemiah. And if you can read Cherokee, it's Nehemiah. 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 And we're looking at chapter number 2, and we're down to verse number 6. Now, just to give you the background, refresh your memory, remember Nehemiah was the cupbearer for the king and is stationed at the Shushan Palace, and that's where his job was, to taste the king's food and wine, to protect the king from those who would poison, and that was a popular way to dispose of the monarchy, was to poison them. So Nehemiah's job, of course, was dangerous, but Nehemiah was given the opportunity to draw closer to the king and to the queen as well, and we'll see that in our verse today. Now, Nehemiah had found out the condition of the city and the terrible afflictions that the people were under there that were trying to rebuild the city. And Ezra, remember, was there already for 10 years, and now Nehemiah finds out about the condition. So the first thing he does is he gets apart, he mourns, he fasts, and he prays. And I'd submit to you that's a good rule of application of God's principle of prayer, is to mourn, fast, and pray for those things that afflict us and challenge us. So don't forget that when the time comes for some big event or some large event or some heavy news, go ahead and start mourning and fasting and praying and preparing your hearts to deal with God and what's coming up. Now you imagine here's Nehemiah. He's a captive, okay? He's been carried off in slavery to another land, a foreign land, but God has, through his providence, put him in the special position of being right next to the king every day. Because whenever the king ate, Nehemiah was there. Whenever he drank, Nehemiah was there. And it was like that for his whole duty, or his tour, as it were, as cupbearer for the king. Now, of course, when you're the cupbearer for the king, you had to be on your toes, you had to be politically correct and all those kind of things, and you had to please the king. And we see here by Nehemiah's relationship with the king and with the queen, we can see that he went far in his friendship with them. And now let's look at the response. Nehemiah blurted out this and says, I can't be happy when everything is going on, the place of my dad and my forefathers' graves and all that are all tore up, and the gates are burnt at Jerusalem, and the walls are still torn down, and we got the raiding parties coming along and tearing up all the work that's accomplished. He said, I can't be happy. So the king now sees that his heart's troubled, and now here is Nehemiah. He decides he's going to tell the king what's in his heart. Verse number 6 says, And the king said unto me, now notice this little footnote here, the queen also sitting by him. As was customary, a queen would sit beside the king in all matters of state. Now look what it says. For how long shall thy journey be, and when wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So now Nehemiah wants to go back and rebuild the walls and rebuild the gate for the city. In other words, prepare the city for occupation, once again for the reoccupation of the Jews. And you think about it now, it's been 70 years that Israel has been in captivity under the Babylonian captivity. But God promised that through these kings that they would come back. And now 70 years has begun when Nehemiah has been given permission to go back. So he puts his petition before the king. Now you can see providence in every verse where God has lined these things up and put Nehemiah in the position he was in, but not just that, but that Nehemiah was a personable person. In other words, he was very good at what he did, and they enjoyed his presence. And his queen and the king were there, and they're sitting beside each other. And I don't doubt the queen gave the king a nudge. The king was probably saying, oh, you make me a list of what you want to do, and I'll consider it. But I don't doubt that the queen gave him a little nudge with the elbow and said, you need to let him go. And then the king says, well, how long shall thy journey be, and when wilt thou return? So what does that mean when he says that? All right, you're going, but how long are you going to be gone? I want to make sure you come back. Now, why would the king want him back? Right, because he's cupbearer, but he's also his friend. So Nehemiah had worked hard on being a good servant. And now the fruits of all that labor that he's put into this job and being a good servant, being a good person, demonstrating his faith to this king, has now beginning to reap rewards. The queen and the king give permission for him to go. And he says, well, how long are you going to go for? And when are you going to come back? So that means the king wasn't discharging him from his position. Matter of fact, the king was asking, hey, when you coming back? I want to make sure you come back. So then he says in verse number 7, moreover, I said unto the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me to the governors beyond the river, that they may convey me over till I come into Judah. Now notice here, Nehemiah has been in a political office here. He's had a political appointment, and he knows the ins and outs of politics. And he knows that it's no shame to ask the king for help in getting there. Now you can imagine if you were traveling in those days, what would it be like for you? What's the dangers and the perils of long journeys? Robbers, thieves, murderers, just plain old bad people will come upon you and take everything you've got and probably take your life with them. They were known for doing that in the day when they would call them highwaymen. And that was how they made a living, was robbing from pilgrims and strangers passing through. So you can imagine how dangerous it was to journey by yourself. So he says, King, I want you to give me some letters that will introduce me to the governors of your provinces. And as I go to that province, I'll go to that governor and I'll show him the letter, and then they can escort me through their country and make sure that I'm safe. Okay, now this doesn't say Nehemiah doubting God's, but it doesn't hurt to ask the king for these things while you have his ear. So Nehemiah wasn't afraid to ask, and he realized that this trial would be dangerous and that he needed this protections as they went through these lands. Now look at verse 8. He also had another request. Now it's interesting how God had put these things on Nehemiah's heart. God had said, Nehemiah, you need to go back. Okay, well, how am I going to get away from the king? So Nehemiah, as he petitions the king, and no doubt the queen was there, and I don't doubt that they had a good rapport between each other. You know how business with kings are, as you talk in politics, and it's wah, 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 wah. I don't doubt that him and the queen had a good relationship, and I'm not talking about an immoral relationship. I'm just talking about a servant and queen, or a relationship that was a friend to friend. And I don't doubt that the queen punched the king in the ribs and said, hey, you need to let him go. He's a good fella. So God's prepared him for this, and now he's not afraid to ask the king. Now, if you looked at that other part that said he was scared, he said here, verse 2, he said, then I was very sore afraid. So Nehemiah was seen that he was sad in his countenance, and that's not usual. Nehemiah is usually a joyful person, a person that did good in his work, a person that was joyful, a person that was good to be around. There's a lot of illustrations here for us, spiritually speaking, we should be the same way. People should want to be around us and have joy in our joy. We should be overflowing with joy to other people, not just to those that we know, but that joy should come forth to others so that they can see what it is that we have that is different from the rest of the world. Now look here, he says in verse number 8, and a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's what? All right, now that's kind of interesting. What's he saying? Why does he want a letter to the king's forest keeper? Yep, he needs some timber. You think about it, you're going back to the gates and you're back to the walls. What are you going to need to put those walls and those gates up? You're going to need timber. Now, they had the rock there because most of that stuff was just laying around. If it hadn't been carried off, the rocks would be there. So he needed the timbers up because there would be no timbers around Jerusalem. Most of those have been destroyed or used during the captivity and had been used by the people that were poor. They would go down and chop the trees. So there wouldn't be a whole lot of lumber around, nor a way to make the lumber, because the Israelites didn't have any of the equipment. They weren't allowed to have any type of tools, any type of weapons, anything like that. So he says, King, I'm going to need a letter to Asaph, the keeper of your forest. He said that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which appertain to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Now I want you to see this. He said, King, I'm going to need timber for this, for the walls, and for the house I'm going to build for me. So Nehemiah is planning on staying there. But from the conversation previous to this, we see that Nehemiah has been given a certain date and time to come back. So Nehemiah is going to have to come back, but Nehemiah now is going to be the governor of Jerusalem when he gets this process done. So notice this, what he says here at the end, and the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Well, what's that mean? The king granted me. Right. He gave him everything he asked for. Now you think about this. Here's a Jew. That's a captive, a slave. He's been over there in Shushan for a while now. I don't know how old he is, but he's been there a while. And he has a good position, a good job. How did he get that good job? Well, God gave him that good job. And he took advantage of that good job and did good. And did what was right. He was a good servant. He wasn't a lazy servant. You're not going to last long being lazy in the king's service, are you? No. And there's a spiritual parallel for us as well. We can't be lazy in the service of our king. We must be active about God's business. And then notice this also, he says, and the king granted me, which means he gave me, according to the good hand of who? My God. How? God's hand was upon Nehemiah. You can see this from just standing back and looking at the account that Nehemiah records. You can see God's moving behind the scenes in providence and arranging these things to happen at just the right time. Now remember, Ezra has gone on 10 years prior. And Ezra's been trying for that long to get the house of God built and to get things done, but it's not happening. He can't overcome the factions, and he couldn't overcome the enemies and all of that. So God has raised up Nehemiah to be in a position where he can actually help finish the job. So Nehemiah is brave enough to ask the king for letters of escort, for timber, and for timber to build not only the gate, but also a house for him while he was there. So that tells you Nehemiah planned on being there. But now he's asking, as an official in the government, he's asking the king to grant his request. And he says, God's hand is upon me. And the Lord had, let me read it again. He says, and the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Now notice how Nehemiah again had started with mourning, fasting, and prayer. Notice that. Then again, as God moves him through this situation, you remember he goes in sad, he'd been mourning, he'd been crying, he'd been fasting, so you could tell his cheeks would be sunk in a little bit. And the king noticed it right off, noticed that he wasn't like his normal self. Now, if you've ever had a food taster, and you see something wrong with that food taster, what would that tell you? Something might be wrong. He might have got poisoned. He might just be sick. He was inquiring about Nehemiah. And Nehemiah said, boy, I was scared then, because I've never been unhappy in the presence of the king before. I'd never been this way before, and I was afraid. But God took the reins here, and he gave that king wisdom. And the king saw that he was upset, and he asked him what was going on with him. So Nehemiah tells. And through this conversation, this godly conversation now, and I don't doubt that Nehemiah prayed right before him. Look at verse 4. It says, then the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? And then look what it says. So I prayed to the God of heaven. So right there in the presence of the king, what did he do? He prayed. There's a secret to success of Nehemiah. That's his secret to success. He prayed. He believed. He trusted in God and believed that God would take care of him. And look what he says. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. God was upon him through this whole series of events that would lead him to be able to go back and build those city gates and walls and houses. So you think about that. The success of Nehemiah started with prayer. The success of Nehemiah ends with prayer. And Nehemiah has taken this job seriously. He has done it well. And now that relationship he's had with the king and the queen as a good servant, as a wise servant, as a servant that was willing to die for them, they took great pleasure in helping him do what they wanted him to do, and that was to go do what he wanted and then come back. Now that tells you they wanted him back. That tells you how good and important a person he was to the king and the queen. They had grown to love him over this time, and that's obvious because they wanted him to come back. Now, if you had an employee that wasn't that good and he decided he was leaving, what would you normally do? Bye. See you later. But no, that wasn't what happened. The king says, hey, you give me a time, how long you're going to take, and I'll be looking for you to come back. So that tells you that there's a great relationship there that's been developed over the years. It tells you also that because of that relationship, that God has given him the wisdom to do right, the wisdom to act right in the presence of royalty, and the wisdom to be among a bunch of politicians. Now, how many of you know about politics? What does politics usually remind you of? A bunch of backstabbing people, I tell you that. Okay? Nobody can get along. Everybody's arguing. There's always some kind of drama somewhere. There's always some kind of subterfuge here, some kind of lying going on here, some kind of slander over here, and it's just a big ball of mess. But God put Nehemiah in there, and he wasn't that way. Nehemiah was a godly man, a God-fearing man, and he knew that the hand of God was upon him, because here he is now presenting his petition to God. And as he presents that petition to the king, God has his hand upon him to guide him through this process of going back. So it's amazing what God can do with a person that's willing to do what they're supposed to when they're supposed to. You see, God had put him in that position, but Nehemiah was the one that had to act. And it's up to each one of us when God puts us in a good position and an opportunity like this will come up, then we're supposed to act upon that situation, whatever it is. It can be anything. But God will give us the opportunity and put His Spirit upon our hearts to where we say, hey, I need to do this. And God will help you do that. We can apply that, spiritually speaking, to when it comes time to tell somebody about the Lord. If we're going to school or if we're in our public job and God says, hey, go talk to that person. Well, go talk to them. But what do you talk to them about? Well, you talk to them about the Lord. If the Lord's sending you, there's a reason He wants you to talk to them. So start talking about the Lord, and that will work your way through what the Lord wants to do with that person. So it's a key part of being a faithful servant and a good servant is willing to yield to the Lord whenever He would have you do something. And Nehemiah, remember, had mourned, fasted, and prayed. And then he prayed again in the presence of the king, and God gave him the strength and the courage to ask the king at that time. And God can do that with us. He can give us the courage, the strength, and the determination we need to do what we need to do for God. And you can see as that progresses through this chapter and through the rest of the book, you'll see Nehemiah does great things for God. But it starts with prayer, fasting, and mourning over the sins of his people. Now remember, Nehemiah included himself in those sinners. It said that my fathers and I have sinned. And he confessed on a intercessor level his sin, the sin of his father, and the sin of his people. And each one of us needs to think about that. Is there sin in our lives that we need to confess? Is there a reason why we've been afflicted and punished? Is there a reason why we're captive in a foreign land? And of course the answer would come back for Nehemiah. Yes, sin. Sin put us here. We rejected God. We turned our backs on God. Now we're going to have to pay for that rejection, for that sin. But God told them and warned them that it would be 70 years. Jeremiah told them specifically 70 years. Daniel figured that out. While he was in captivity, he read the book of Jeremiah and saw that it would be 70 years before Israel would get to return home. And that 70 weeks starts here in chapter number 2 with Nehemiah asking the king to go back. So as we look at this, go ahead and read through the next few verses, and you'll see that once you decide to do something for God, and God blesses you to do it, then you're going to find out opposition is going to take place. You're going to find out that the old devil don't want that to happen. And he's going to send roadblocks to you. He's going to try to stop you. But don't let that dissuade you from doing what God would have you to do. Don't let the devil stop you or rob you from doing God's will. Just think about that, and we'll stop right there for the evening. Let's all stand.